Okay, so today we're going deep on something a bit different, maybe even a little unsettling.
Hmm. Spooky season deep dive.
Yeah, something like that. We're looking at get this, a Japanese government website about how to prepare, like actually prepare for wartime scenarios.
Oh wow, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Not exactly your typical lighthearted podcast fare.
No, not at all. But I think it's, fascinating and maybe, just maybe, could be life-saving information, so bear with us.
I'm all ears. What's got the Japanese government so concerned that they're putting out survival guides?
Well, it's not like there's one specific threat they're pointing to. It's more like they acknowledge that, well, wartime scenarios are unpredictable. And being prepared could, really minimize harm.
Makes sense. I
Yeah.
mean, look, we all hope for peace, but hoping doesn't put together an emergency kit.
Exactly. What I found really interesting is the Japanese government actually gives like detailed guidance to its citizens on how to respond to all sorts of threats, like war and terrorism.
Really? Are we talking pamphlets or full-on, like, disaster movie-style training videos?
More like practical advice and checklists on their website, although I wouldn't be surprised if they have videos too. But get this, they have over 50,000 designated evacuation shelters stocked with supplies.
50,000.
Yeah,
That's wild. I mean, that's a whole different level of preparedness, right?
yeah.
It makes you wonder what they know that we don't.
Right. I know. It really makes you think. But okay, let's say, hypothetically, the unthinkable happens. What are some of the first things you should do, if you find yourself in a wartime situation?
Okay, well, the guide starts with the basics, like what to do if you hear an air raid siren.
Oh, so like those scenes in old war movies.
Yeah, exactly like that. First things first, you secure your home. So that means shutting off gas, water, electricity. Then you got to find a safe spot indoors, away from windows, obviously. If you're outside, seek sturdy shelter immediately.
It's funny, we've all seen those scenes in movies, but I never really thought about what I would actually do. I mean, my first instinct, honestly, would be to grab my phone.
Yeah, to call for help or check the news, right?
Yeah.
But think about it. Cell networks could be overloaded, maybe even totally disrupted.
Oh, true. Panic calls and everyone's trying to upload videos at the same time.
Exactly. The
Mm.
guide actually recommends relying more on radio broadcasts.
Radio, like old school radio.
Yeah, old school. Those are more likely to stay operational in a crisis.
Mm.
So the hand-cranked radio, that's going to be on the emergency kit list, right?
Okay, makes sense. So no doom scrolling during a wartime scenario. Got it. What else is in this Japanese emergency kit?
Well, they recommend having enough water for each person for at least 3 days.
3 days. Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
3 liters a day per person. Plus non-perishable food, any essential medications, obviously a first aid kit, and yeah, the hand-cranked radio we talked about.
You know, Hearing all this makes me realize my emergency kit is pathetic. Like, I've got half a bag of stale crackers and some sunscreen that expired 3 years ago. Not exactly going to cut it in a war zone.
Well, hey, it's never too late to get serious about prepping. And honestly, a lot of these supplies would be helpful in any emergency, right? Natural disaster, power outage, zombie apocalypse, you name it.
That's true. That's true. Okay, I'm feeling a little motivated now. So, this Japanese guide, it doesn't just stop at emergency kits, does it? It actually outlines different wartime scenarios, right?
You got it. They've got 5 distinct scenarios: small-scale attacks, missile strikes, ground invasions, air raids.
Okay, those are bad enough, but I'm guessing scenario number 5 is the one that really keeps people up at night.
You bet. Nuclear, biological, or chemical attacks.
Yeah, that's the stuff of nightmares.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for each of those scenarios, they outline the risks and what they recommend people do to respond.
All right, let's break it down. Let's start with those small-scale attacks. The guide mentions dirty bombs specifically. Those sound absolutely terrifying. What exactly are we talking about here?
Right, so a dirty bomb is basically a conventional explosive,
Yeah.
but it's mixed with radioactive material.
So, like, not a nuke, but...
Right, not a full-blown nuclear explosion,
Right.
but it's designed to spread radioactive contamination over a larger area.
So the damage is more long-term than immediate.
Exactly. The biggest risk is exposure to that radioactive fallout, which, can lead to all sorts of health problems later on.
So what do you do if one of these things goes off near you? Do you run? Do you hide?
The guide says the most important thing is to shelter indoors immediately, like right away. Seal up windows, ventilation systems, anything that could let in radioactive particles.
That makes sense. Keep it out. Keep it out.
Right. And of course, follow any instructions given by, government authorities. They'll be the ones coordinating the response and giving guidance on decontamination and all that.
Okay, so dirty bombs. Check. What about missile strikes? I always hear there's barely any time to react if one's detected. Is that true?
Unfortunately, yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Hmm.
The guide says the window between, detecting a missile and potential impact, it could be as little as 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so immediate action is key. Ideally, you'd want to be in an underground shelter, but even finding a really sturdy building or using the terrain for cover, like getting behind a hill or something, could help.
That reminds me of the story a friend told me about her dad. He survived the Hiroshima bombing because, by pure chance, he happened to be behind a hill when it happened. That little bit of elevation probably saved his life.
It's amazing how even small things can make a huge difference in these situations.
Absolutely. All right, so we covered dirty bombs and missile strikes. What's next on the list of terrifying scenarios? Ground invasion.
Yep, that's the one. And that feels like, the most classic wartime scenario.
Right out of a history book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in this case, the guide stresses that you've got to be aware of potential enemy advancement routes, as well as any, strategic targets in your area.
Strategic targets. Like what?
Oh, things like airports, harbors, military bases, anything that an enemy force might try to seize or destroy.
So it's not just about hunkering down in your basement. You might have to move, relocate.
Exactly. And you got to be prepared for the possibility of long-term displacement, maybe weeks, maybe even months, without access to regular supplies and infrastructure.
Which brings us back to that well-stocked emergency kit,
You
right?
got it.
Yeah.
Canned goods, water filters, all that good stuff.
Okay, noted. Now, what about air raids? Those seem so chaotic, so unpredictable. How do you even begin to wrap your head around preparing for something like that?
Well, air raids, they are hard to predict. But the guide points out that historically they often focus on certain types of targets, like infrastructure, government buildings, military installations.
So basically anything that keeps a country running.
Exactly. So knowing what potential targets are in your area, that could be helpful.
Okay, that makes a bit of sense. Now, I think it's time to face the big one, the one we've all been kind of dreading: nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. The guide doesn't, sugarcoat the horrors of these weapons, and rightfully so. But what are some of the key things it says about surviving these types of attacks?
Well, minimizing exposure, that's the overarching message. Shelter is paramount. Whether it's a purpose-built fallout shelter or the most sealed-off room you can find in your house, as far from the outside as possible, that's your best bet.
So basically, get away from windows and doors.
Exactly. And the guide also outlines decontamination procedures, stressing how important it is to, thoroughly clean yourself and anything you've been exposed to, and of course, seeking medical attention if necessary.
Okay, I can see how that would be crucial. And it's important to remember there's a difference between chemical and biological weapons, right?
Absolutely. While both are incredibly dangerous, biological weapons can spread from person to person, which makes containing them much more challenging.
Yeah, that adds a whole other level of complexity. But for now, let's focus on nuclear attacks. Those seem to be what most people are worried about these days.
Good point. And, most of us have some vague idea about how horrible a nuclear attack would be, but I'm curious to hear what the guide says about the immediate impact and those long-term consequences.
Me too, me too. I think we all need a bit of, well, a dose of reality, even if it's unsettling.
Right, so the guide actually uses the Hiroshima bombing as an example, just to highlight how devastating even a single nuclear weapon can be.
It's hard to even imagine the sheer force of an explosion like that.
It really is. And the impact, it goes way beyond just the immediate blast. The guide talks about the danger of radioactive fallout, which can contaminate huge areas and linger for years, decades even.
So surviving the initial blast, that's just the beginning.
Yeah, it's just the start. The real test is figuring out how to navigate a world that's been fundamentally changed. Where there's radiation, food shortages, societal breakdowns, all of it.
Wow, that's a lot to process. But I'm ready to face the fallout, both literally and figuratively. Let's dive into that.
So like we were saying, surviving that initial blast, that's just the first hurdle in a nuclear attack. This Japanese guide, it really emphasizes that the aftermath, that post-nuclear landscape, as they call it, that's the real challenge.
Yeah, that post-nuclear landscape doesn't exactly sound like a place I'd want to vacation. But seriously, what does that even look like? I mean, I get that there's widespread destruction, but what are the specific threats people would actually face?
Well, first, there's that radioactive fallout, right? That invisible danger we talked about. It can make huge areas unsafe to be outside without protection, maybe for years even.
Years. Wow. Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see why those fallout shelters were such a big deal. But, okay, radiation aside, what other things would people have to deal with?
Well, think about it. All the stuff we take for granted, electricity, clean water, healthcare, all that, it would probably be disrupted, maybe even totally gone. That means shortages, mass displacement, people desperately searching for resources.
So it's not just about surviving the explosion itself. It's about surviving in a world that's completely changed.
You got it. And this is where, the psychological and social aspects of survival come in. The guide doesn't really focus on mental health specifically, but it does suggest that community, social cohesion, that's going to be super important during a crisis.
Yeah, I can imagine facing something like this alone would be absolutely terrifying.
For sure. And history shows us time and time again that those communities that can stay strong, support each other emotionally, resist that urge to panic, they're the ones that tend to bounce back.
So it's not just about having supplies and a plan, it's about building those social connections that help people cope and, adapt to these insane circumstances.
You got it. It's about the human element, the emotions, the need to connect with others, the power of working together.
It's funny you say that. I remember reading about those incredible acts of kindness that happened after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. People risking their lives to help strangers, sharing food, finding hope amidst all that despair. It's amazing.
Those stories, they show the best of humanity, don't they? They remind us that even in the darkest moments, compassion and empathy can still win out.
It's strange, isn't it, that something as horrific as a nuclear attack could actually bring out the best in some people.
I think it speaks to that basic need we all have for connection and that ability we have to be resilient, even when we face such incredible loss and suffering.
Okay, so we've talked about, the physical dangers, the social stuff, but let's shift gears for a second and talk about something else that's crucial for survival but often gets overlooked: accurate information.
Right, that's a big one. The Japanese guide, they hit on this point over and over again. Critical thinking, relying on verified sources of information, it's so important, especially in wartime. Information can be weaponized.
So you're saying that disinformation, all those rumors and propaganda, they could be as dangerous as a bomb.
Absolutely. Think about it. In a conflict, misinformation spreads like wildfire. It creates panic, it breaks down trust, it can even lead to violence.
So what's the guide's advice? How do you navigate that minefield of information?
They stress the importance of, being cautious, don't believe everything you hear, question those sensationalized stories, cross-check information before you spread it.
It's like you need to develop a whole new set of survival skills, not just for the physical world, but for the information world as well.
You got it. It's about developing what they call media literacy skills, being able to spot fake news from real news and understanding how people can twist information for their own benefit.
Man, this makes me think about all those deep fakes we're seeing now and those sophisticated online disinformation campaigns. In a wartime situation, that technology could be a real weapon.
You're right on the money. Imagine a deep fake video of like a world leader declaring war or a fake news report about an imminent attack. The chaos that could cause, it's mind-blowing.
So this whole preparedness thing, it's not just about like stocking up on food and water, it's about protecting your mind from manipulation.
Exactly. In the age of information, knowledge really is power. And being able to think critically, evaluate sources, resist propaganda, those are essential skills for navigating conflict, any conflict, really.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this Japanese guide is so much more than just a list of survival tips. It's like a whole new way of thinking, a way of being in the world.
You got it. It's about cultivating resilience, adaptability, and that critical thinking we talked about. It's super important.
This is a lot to digest, but I'm honestly feeling more empowered amidst all this uncertainty. Knowledge is power, right?
It absolutely is. The more we know about potential threats and how to respond, the better off we'll be.
Okay, so speaking of threats, you mentioned something earlier that I hadn't even considered: epidemics. The risk of diseases spreading after a war or nuclear attack. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It shows how interconnected everything is, global health and global security. Historically, war creates those perfect conditions for disease to spread.
I can see how that would happen. People being displaced, sanitation breaking down, immune systems weakened from stress and lack of food.
Exactly. And then you add in potential disruptions to healthcare systems, and boom, you've got a recipe for outbreaks.
So it's not just about surviving the bombs themselves, it's about surviving the aftermath, which could include facing deadly diseases.
Right. And that's where understanding basic hygiene, sanitation, first aid, all that becomes so important.
So maybe we should add masks and hand sanitizer to our emergency kits.
Not a bad idea. This guide reminds us that being ready for anything, it's never a bad thing.
I'm with you there. Okay, we've talked about like the immediate threats of war, the long-term challenges of surviving, but there's one more thing I wanted to get your take on: global nuclear war and those automated retaliatory systems, where one launch could set off a chain reaction. It's something the guide mentions. And honestly, it's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic. But it's the reality we live in, right? The idea that the fate of humanity could hinge on a bunch of computer algorithms, it's terrifying.
It feels too big to even comprehend.
It really does. And it highlights how vital international cooperation is. Diplomacy, arms control. We can't just rely on technology to prevent this stuff from happening. We need to be actively working to reduce nuclear arsenals, build trust between countries, all that.
So, in a way, preparing for a nuclear attack also means working to prevent one from happening in the first place.
Absolutely. Our actions matter.
Oh.
Our voices matter.
Mm.
We all have a role to play in creating a safer world.
Okay, that's a powerful message. But before we get too lost in the big picture, let's bring it back down to the individual level. What does the guide say about protecting yourself from the actual effects of a nuclear blast? Like, in terms of shelter and all that.
Right. So they lean on research from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Distance and depth, those are your best bets when it comes to fallout.
So, like, those old school fallout shelters from the Cold War, those actually work.
They do. They're way better than just your average basement or trying to hide in a subway. Purpose-built shelters, they're designed to handle blast waves and radiation, so they offer much better protection.
What about those duck and cover drills we see in old films? Those wouldn't really do much, would they?
Nah, not really. I mean, hiding under a desk might help a tiny bit if there's falling debris,
Mhm.
but it's not going to save you from the heat, the radiation, the blast wave of a nuclear explosion.
So basically, be as far away from the blast as possible and as deep underground as you can get.
Exactly. And the guide also stresses knowing about your ventilation systems.
Ventilation systems. Why is that so important?
Think about it. They could suck in contaminated air from outside, right, exposing you to fallout even if you think you're safe.
Wow, I never thought about that. So sealing off ventilation is key if you're in a fallout shelter.
Big time. And depending on how close you are to the blast, you might need to... Exactly. And holding on to hope. Hope for a future where all this stays hypothetical, not historical.
I like that. Okay, so before we wrap things up, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on, something the Japanese guide mentions but doesn't go into a ton of detail about: the psychological aspect. We've covered the physical stuff, but what about the mental and emotional challenges of dealing with a wartime scenario?
Right, that's often overlooked. But it's crucial. This guide, it talks about building mental resilience, developing coping mechanisms for stress and anxiety, finding purpose and meaning, even in the face of all this.
It makes sense. Even just thinking about this stuff is stressful. Actually living through it would be a whole other level.
Totally. And that's why it's important to prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally, just like we would physically.
So what can people do? How do you build that kind of mental resilience?
Well, it starts with being self-aware, understanding your strengths and weaknesses, what triggers you, how you cope with stress.
Know yourself, basically.
Exactly. And then develop those healthy coping mechanisms. Mindfulness, meditation, exercise, journaling, nature, spending time with people you love, all that stuff helps.
Those are all good ideas, but what about when you're facing extreme stress, like actual trauma, like after a nuclear attack?
That's when having a strong support system is absolutely vital. The guide really emphasizes community. Reach out to others, share your burdens, help each other through the tough times.
Don't go it alone, basically.
Exactly. We need each other, especially during a crisis.
A burden shared is a burden halved, right?
Right. And it's not just about sharing those burdens, it's about sharing joy, too. Finding those moments of lightness and humor. Remembering that even in darkness, there's still beauty, there's still love, there's still hope.
Man, that's a beautiful thought. Okay, let's bring it back down to earth for a moment. The guide also talks about communication and evacuation, right? Having a plan for those things.
You got it. They stress how important it is to have a plan, not just for yourself, but for your family and your community.
So it's not just about having a go bag and a meeting point. It's about knowing who to contact, how to contact them, and what to do if you need to evacuate.
Right. They say you should have a communication plan with family members, figure out evacuation routes, know your local emergency procedures.
Be proactive, be informed, be ready to act.
Got it. And be flexible. Evacuation might not always be possible. Sometimes sheltering in place is the safest thing to do.
So have a plan A, a plan B, and maybe a plan C.
Exactly. And be ready for communication breakdowns. The guide suggests having backup methods like those hand-cranked radios, walkie-talkies, even prearranged visual signals.
It's interesting, they're really pushing us to think outside the box, consider options we wouldn't normally use.
It's all about adapting, right?
I guess so. Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. Long-term survival, community, mental preparedness, communication, evacuation. It's been a lot to process, but really informative. Before we move on, though, I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier. Hope. The power of the human spirit to overcome adversity. I think it's so easy to get bogged down in the doom and gloom of all this, but it's important to remember that even in the darkest times, there's still light to be found.
Absolutely. Humans, we've been through a lot.
Yeah.
Wars, famines, natural disasters, pandemics, you name it.
Yeah.
And we've always found ways to endure, to rebuild, to come out the other side stronger.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
It really is. And it shows that hope. It's not just some passive feeling. It's an active force that pushes us to keep going, to find solutions, to build a better future, no matter what.
Those are powerful words. I think we all need to hear that, especially these days.
We do. And as we wrap up this part of our conversation, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Cultivate that sense of hope within yourselves and within your communities. Embrace the power of knowledge. Nurture those connections with each other. And never, ever give up on creating a more peaceful and just world.
That's a beautiful challenge. And to our listeners, thank you for sticking with us through this deep dive. It's been a lot to take in, but we hope you found it valuable and maybe even a little bit empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, community is strength, and hope. Hope is what keeps us moving forward, even when things feel impossible. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into wartime preparedness. I gotta say, this has been a pretty intense but really insightful journey so far. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this whole topic.
Yeah, definitely. When you start thinking about preparing for the unexpected,
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much to consider. And this Japanese guide, it really does offer a ton of knowledge and practical advice.
Totally. And one of the things that's really stuck with me throughout all this is how much the guide emphasizes not just surviving a crisis, but actually thriving afterwards.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. They're not just talking about hunkering down and waiting it out.
Exactly. It's more about adapting, rebuilding, creating a new normal. It really got me thinking.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like they're encouraging a mindset shift.
Hmm.
Be resilient, resourceful, build community.
Right. It's like those stories you hear about communities coming together after a natural disaster or something, people helping each other out, sharing what they have, finding creative solutions to problems.
Those stories are amazing. They really show the strength of the human spirit. And I think that's what this guide is getting at. Preparedness isn't just about individual survival. It's about collective resilience.
That's a good point. I mean, we're social beings, right? Our ability to connect with each other, cooperate, that's how we've always overcome challenges.
Exactly. Think about it. In a post-war world where everything's been disrupted, resources are scarce, dangers everywhere, those social bonds become even more important.
You're right. Trust, working together, having a shared purpose, those things would be absolutely essential.
Absolutely. I think this guide, in a way, it's reminding us to not just prepare for the worst, but to also appreciate what we have. Our communities, our infrastructure, just the fact that we have easy access to food and water, we take it all for granted.
Yeah, that's true. It's a good reminder.
It really is. When we started this deep dive, it felt pretty heavy, even anxiety-provoking at times. But now, I don't know, I'm actually feeling kind of hopeful.
Me too, actually.
Yeah.
It's empowering to realize that we can prepare for these things, even the really scary stuff. And by doing that, we might actually make our communities stronger.
Exactly. Well said.
All right, I think it's about time to wrap up our deep dive into wartime preparedness. It's been quite a journey. But before we go, I wanted to leave our listeners with a few final thoughts. What do you think?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone listening would love to hear your take on all this.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is just how important it is to be informed and prepared. We live in a crazy world. Things can change in an instant. It's not enough to just hope for the best anymore. We have to actively protect ourselves, our loved ones, our communities.
Couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, plain and simple.
Right. But I also want to say that being prepared doesn't mean living in a constant state of fear.
Yeah, it's not about being paranoid.
Exactly. It's about taking responsibility, learning what we can, and developing that resilience, being able to adapt.
It's about taking control as much as we can.
Exactly. And remembering that we're not in this alone. We have each other, we have our communities. And we have that shared human spirit, that ability to overcome, to rebuild.
That's a great point. And on that note, I want to encourage everyone listening to take what they've learned and apply it to their own lives. Start small. Take it step by step. Every effort you make towards being prepared is a win.
I love that. And all our listeners, thank you for coming along with us on this deep dive. We know it's been heavy at times, but hopefully you found it valuable, maybe even empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, community is strength, and hope, well, hope is what keeps us going even when things seem impossible.